Hey everyone, today we're going to look at making a bullet system inside of Unity, a projectile system. This one is mouse controlled. So you see as I move my mouse around my scene, snaps around, can move underneath or on top. Basically wherever my mouse is pointing, it will point as well. Every time I left click, it'll fire out a projectile, and I can move this all around as I move it my scene. So let me show you how you'll get started with making this. Let me stop. The first thing I want to do is I want to go here and make a new scene. So go to your scenes folder, right click, create scene. You can call it something like projectile demo. Say whatever scene you were working in, and go ahead and open up this new scene. So the first thing I'm going to do in my scene is I'm going to go ahead and make my ground plane, like I do in lots of ones. You can either grab your platform prefab in here, or if you want to make one, just come here, plus, 2D object, sprite, square. I like to reset it to 0. Bring it down to the bottom. Use my scale tool over here, and just drag it out until it covers the bottom of the screen. Last thing I want to do is add a box collider to it so that the player can stand on it. And that should be it for the platform. Second thing I'm going to do is go into my prefabs and grab my player prefab, and then just drag it out here and reset it as well. So I'm going to take a look real fast, make sure we can move. Oh, not quite yet. Fast. I just need to make sure that I add my new movement script to this player prefab. So I'm just going to drop that on here, and now I should be able to move. Oh, I will if I add my variables. Sorry, 1 second. Speed something like 5. Jump something like 800 maybe. Let's see. Maybe a little too high. Let me turn up my gravity. Turn my gravity scale to something like 3. Yeah, that's better. I'll take that. So just make sure that you can move around in your scene with your player. So once we have our player set up, what we want to do is come up to it, make sure our player is selected. We want to hit this plus. We say create empty child, because we want to create a child game object under the player. And we can call this something like rotate point, because this is going to be the center position that everything rotates in. And then after that, we're going to come down here, hit plus again, create empty child, and we're going to call this bullet transform, projectile transform. Doesn't have to be a bullet. Projectile transform, something like that. And then on here, we're going to do something else. We want to add a sprite to this to kind of show where we are aiming, and also to show where the projectiles are going to come from. So over here, go to add component, and then come down to sprite renderer. And then this will give us the option to put a sprite on here. And we'll just come here to sprite, click the bullseye, and then click this little eye icon and call it square. If you can't see it, make sure this is unselected so that you can see all the add-ons and the plugins. And then we'll grab the square from there. And just double click. Change the color so it's distinct. I'm just going to make mine black. And then from here, what you want to do, grab your movement tool and you just want to drag it out somewhere. And you want to scale it down. Oops. I'm going to click this pane to make sure that everything's constrained together. I'm going to go down to something like 0.2. And I'll put this out on maybe 1. Maybe a little farther. I think maybe 1.5 will be good. So it's at 1.5. Something like this. Well, something right in the middle. We'll see. We'll say 1.25. Yeah, that looks good to me. Okay. So what you should have at this point is a player, a rotation point, and a projectile transform that has been scaled down and moved away from the player. But everything should be based around this very center point. That is important. All right, so the next thing you want to do is we want to start making our script. So if you come down here, go to your rotate point, right click, and you can come down to your scripts folder, right click, create, on a behavior script. You can call this something like projectile base or something like this. Okay. And once you have that created, you can go ahead and drag that up and you can drop it on not your player, but your rotate point. This is good because it'll free up space. Sorry, it's just going to reload. This is good because it won't clutter your player script, your movement script with additional stuff. So we can just drop it on here. Okay, so now that it's reloaded, let me try dragging it again. There we go. And now it's added. So I'll open that up. Drag them up here. By default, what we want to do is we want to set up some variables. So the first one is we want to set up our camera in order to get the view of where the camera is rotated around. So we're going to say private camera. We're going to call this main cam. Then we're going to get a vector 3. Mouse position, mouse pause. This is going to get the vector that our mouse is located in. And then we want to get a few more. We want to say public game object, my projectile. And this is going to be what we actually end up firing. Like transform, projectile, transform, public boolean. To see if we can fire, we can call it can fire. And what else do we need? Oh, a timer. Because otherwise you can spam projectiles and crash your game. And if we have a timer, we need float that has something like time between firing. Long variable but short. And I think this is all you'll need for the first one. We'll always come back here if I missed anything. So the first thing we want to do is we want to grab our camera. This isn't strictly necessary, but if you have more than one camera in your scene, this one will grab just the main cam, so you won't mess with any other cameras you create. So we'll say main cam equals game object dot find game object. Make sure you select find game object with tag, not objects with tag, or this won't work. So find game object with tag. And your camera already should be tagged main camera, I believe. And then dot get component and camera, just autofill. So that's what this first line should look like. It's a lot like when we grab a rigid body 2D, but we're grabbing the camera instead. Okay. And then in our update, we're going to put kind of the logic that we need to create a rotation. So the first thing is that we need to get mouse position equals main cam. And then here is why we're getting the camera in the first place. We're going to say screen to world point. And what this is doing is it's basically setting our screen space where our mouse is located on our screen as world space. So like in our game object, in our game environment, where like +2 or -3, it's translating those pixels from the screen, the pixel location, to a game location. And this is what this method is doing. And what we're going to tell it what to do is we're going to get an input, just like we got with our horizontal and our spacebar. This one's going to be called mouse position. And we'll see what that is in a second. Because again, remember, this was a variable here. And then from this point, we need to set up rotation. So we'll say vector3 rotation equals mouse position minus transform dot position. Basically what we're going to do later. You'll see where we get to in a second, but we're going to subtract the transform position of our game object from the mouse position to create this. Okay. So you can go ahead and save. And now we're going to get into some rotation math inside of Unity. Don't be too intimidated by this off the bat. Basically, we have to do a couple of things because of how Unity processes rotation. So Unity may process rotation in a number of ways, such as radians, degrees, or something called quaternions. And we're going to kind of work in between them all. So don't worry about this too much, but if you're interested in it more, I would recommend checking out Unity's documentation on rotation, because there's a lot to get through that seems complex at first, but after a little bit, it's not too bad. So we're going to set up a new float variable. So we'll call something like float, maybe something like rot_z, rotation z. And we will go get a math function for this. So equals math f dot atan 2. So like I said, return the angle in radians. That's really what we're looking for at the moment. And we're going to say rotation dot y, rotation dot x to get those things. And then we're going to multiply it times another function, which is math f, or another method, I should say, rad to degree, radians to degrees. So then we can return our, oops, I always do this. Take that semicolon off. You don't need it there. So basically we're going in and saying we're going to get the angle in radians, and then we're going to convert those radians to degrees so that they're easier to use. And then we're going to go ahead and set our transform rotation. So transform, this is of the game object we put it on, equals quaternion Euler. And then this is basically we're going in and getting the rotation z value that we set up in a second ago. So first is 0, 0, because we're only rotating around the z in 2D. So we'll say rotation z, rot z, that variable we set up ahead. Okay. And then let's go ahead and save that and go back to our game. One second, it's just loading in. So at this point, if we click play, you can now see that we actually do have a little aim reticle, and it is rotating correctly around the player like we want it to. So that is working. So what we can do is go ahead and stop. Now we need to get the actual projectile part set up. All right, so let's take a look here. Let me jump back into my script. We need to set up a couple more things. So this is all great. We'll have it set up. So now we need to set up our projectiles. So we'll stay within the update and keep it here. And we'll say if input dot get mouse button down, this one, and then it auto-completed. What you want to put in here is 0, and that is basically telling you which mouse button to get. So in this case, 0 is the left click. And then we'll go ahead and put it in like this. And then as an if statement, we always put it in curly brackets. And so we'll close them here. And then here's what we're going to provide. So we're going to use a method called instantiate. We're going to say instantiate. And then up ahead, we set up a variable called myProjectile. This is going to be what we fire. So a bullet, a fireball, whatever you want to fire out of your character, myProjectile. And then we're going to get its transform position. So projectile, this is where it's going to start from. Projectile transform dot position. And then up atop, that was a transform, remember? We're going to get that from the little aimer that we set up. Transform dot position. And then the last one is we're going to set the rotation. So I'm going to set quaternion dot identity. And that's just going to grab the quaternion rotation of like a reticle that we have set up. Okay. So that will work there for a second. But there's one more thing I want to do before we leave the script. And it's basically, I want to go ahead and put an input lag in between when you can fire. Because as of now, if you try to do it, you can actually like press it super fast, spawn too many particles, and crash your game. So let's put in some kind of delay in what we can do. And that's that timer that we're setting up here and the time between firing. So the first thing we're going to see is we need a Boolean to determine whether or not we can fire. So let's see if can fire, and then if can fire is false, this is what the shorthand means. So it'd be like if can fire equals false, but that's a quicker way to write it. So if it's false, we're going to do this. We're going to say timer plus equals time dot delta time. And delta time, remember, is the timer like the whole game is running on. When you click start, it starts at 0 and counts up the entire time. And then we're saying this timer is constantly adding whatever delta time is. So we'll go plus, and delta time is not like the overall, it's not absolute time. It's just basically, since we call delta time 1, 2, 3, 4, and then if we call it again, it resets 1, 2, 3, 4, and the timer is going to store that value. If timer is greater than time between firing, and this is a variable, remember, that's a float we're going to set. So we're basically going to set how fast we can shoot. Oops, not a semicolon, sorry. If statement, wrap it in brackets. We'll say can fire equals true, and we'll say timer equals 0. So basically we'll go in and reset that timer. And the last thing we need to do is come down to our input and we need to set another condition. So we need to say mouse button down and, so we do the and, can fire, just can fire. That means can fire equals true. Okay. So let's go ahead and save. Come back here, we'll let our scene reload. Okay. And then we have a couple things we need to drop onto our script and set up some boundaries. So the first thing is my projectile. We actually don't have one yet, so we'll need to make a projectile in a second. And then we need our projectile transform, which we do have. It's right underneath. So we can grab that and drop it down. And then we need to set some kind of time between firing value. So maybe to start with, we'll say something like 0.3 seconds, but you can always fine tune this. So if you try to play now, because you don't have that game object set, you're just not going to see anything. And you'll get an error because that bullet or whatever projectile you're firing has not been assigned. So what we need to do at this point is go ahead and make our projectile. So to do that, I'm going to come over here to the plus in my hierarchy, go to 2D object. I'm going to create a sprite square. That'll just pop up here. I'm going to reset it to 0. It's smack dab in the middle. And then I'm going to set the scale to 0.05 and 0.1, I think. If you see, we can't see it because it's under our player. If you hit our player, you can see down here we've got this really small projectile-like thing. So what I want to do is right-click, rename it, call it projectile, and then what I want to do is I want to go to my prefabs, and I actually want to just drag it down, or wherever you take it. So drag it down into your assets, and we're going to turn it into a prefab. So mine's right here as projectile. From this point, we can actually go ahead in here and delete it, because we can work with it as a projectile in here. So I'm going to bring my player back. If you double click on your projectile, it'll open up the prefab editing menu where you do it in isolation. And then we can go ahead and add a component here. So we're going to put a new script on this. Sorry. And I can call the script something like create model behavior script. We can call it something like projectile script. Okay. Then once it's created, give it a second. We can go in and we can start writing the script that will actually start doing some of the behavior for our bullets. So you can think of the rotating cursor that's going around our object as kind of the spawner, and then these as the projectiles or basically particles being spawned. So let me go ahead and open up Unity and double click to open it here. I was trying to open it. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I just couldn't find it. All right, found it, located. It's all good. Okay, so here's our projectile script. Inside here, we're going to start with some variables. So the first one we want to set up is a private, oops, I'll set them up on the start. That was my bad. So go up above the start, and we're going to set private vector3, and we'll call this mouse EOS, mouse position. And we're going to make a private camera, main cam, again, to grab that camera position to translate screen space to world space. And you could actually put all of this in the original script, but I think this works a little bit better. It's a little neater. And then we'll say private rigid body 2D. Make sure you get the 2D one, and we can call it RB. Okay. And then we'll need the force. Basically, this is the speed that the projectile comes out. Public float force. And we'll say, oh, something else we'll need to do is we'll need to set how long this lasts. Because if we don't set a lifetime for a projectile, it will kind of live forever as it shoots into the distance until it hits like a collider. So at this point, we're going to go into our void start. And we're going to actually go ahead and grab a couple things that we need to get. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to basically duplicate our line of code from earlier. We're going to say main cam equals game object find game object, not game objects, find game object with tag. We're going to say that tag is main camera. And then we're going to say get component camera. Just like that. Then we're going to go in and we're actually going to grab our rigid body in the same way. So we're going to say RV equals get component rigid body 2D. And actually remember that we just forgot to add a rigid body to our bullet, but we'll do that as soon as we get out of the editor, as soon as we stop writing our code. Grid line we also take from the last script, so we'll say mouse position equals main cam, and we'll say screen to world port, good point, sorry, and then we'll say input mouse position, and then we'll set that up in the way where it will take it correctly. Now we need to set basically the direction and rotation of our projectiles as they fly out. So we're going to set up a couple variables for there. This is one. So we'll say vector3 direction equals mouse mouse position minus transform dot position, and the object that we put them on. So this basically shows us what direction to fire, because we'll take the location of the mouse on the screen, and then we'll use that to establish our transform position. And then we'll say vector, the direction we fire. Rotation equals transform dot position minus mouse position. Okay, so we'll use these to set our direction and rotation. And then the next thing we need to do is we need to apply these to the rigid body 2D. We're going to be applying our forces. So we'll say RB to go in and access a rigid body. And then we'll say linear velocity equals, and then we're going to need a vector 2 because linear velocity is x and y if it's 2D. So we're going to say new vector 2 direction dot x and direction dot y, because we're going to get it for both. Oh, all right, I forgot one thing. So you don't want to end it there because you want to normalize. If you don't normalize it, like the further you get away from your reticle, from your player, so if you're like at the edge of the screen, it actually will go faster. So we're going to normalize it. So we'll say normalized, and then we'll say times force. And that times force is just the value we set that sets how fast it's going to go. So if it's 0, it's not going to move at all. If it's something like 1,000, it's going to move 1,000 times faster. So we'll decide what a good one is later, what a good value for that is later. Yeah. And now we need to set up the rotation for this. So we'll say float rot, let's shoot for rotation. And we're going to use a couple math functions here. So again, like we were converting between radians, using radians, degrees, and Eulers to set these, we're going to do the same here. So we'll say math f a tan 2 rotation dot y rotation dot x times math f dot radians 2 degrees, rad 2 deg, just to convert it into degrees so we can use it. Then we can use that in our transform dot rotation equals quaternion dot Euler. We use Eulers to set rotations. 0, 0. That's because we're doing the x, y, and z, and we don't use the x or y in 2D. We almost only use the z. And then we'll say rot, which is the value that we converted into degrees, plus 90. And the plus 90 is just to rotate it to the correct orientation. If I set my bullet up correctly, I don't think I would need to do that. But you can adjust this value if it doesn't look quite right coming out. So this is kind of also a safeguard for you if you need to rotate like your sprite or something. And the last thing we need to do is we need to actually destroy the projectile after a certain amount of time. So you can do that using the destroy function. So destroy, and then you can pass in value. So we're going to use game object because we want to destroy the bullet itself, and the script is on the bullet. So we're going to destroy this game object after 1 lifetime. has passed, and the lifetime is a variable that we're going to set later. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. So click save. Let's just jump back into our Unity scene. Give it a second to compile. There we go. So if we go and look at a projectile, we haven't added the script onto it yet. So I'm going to drop it on. So you see I have those two values for force and lifetime. And I also need to add a rigid body 2D. Okay. So rigid body 2D. And we're actually going to use a different body type than we used before, where we want kinematic, which is basically it can move, but it isn't bound by gravity or the other variables here in the same way. So we'll set it from dynamic to kinematic. You actually can leave it as dynamic if you want your bullets to your bullets or projectiles to have drop to them, like you want them to go in arcs, and I'll show you the difference in a second. But kinematic, we'll go ahead and turn this on, and we'll set collision detection to continuous, and we'll set interpolate to interpolate. And basically these just make it detection, I think, a little more reliable. And then force, we can try something like 5 to start. You can basically base this off your player speed because they work about the same. So if your player speed is 5, you probably want your bullets to be a little bit faster, unless you want to run as fast as them. And lifetime we'll play around with, but maybe 2 seconds will start. Okay. And then let's just jump back into our scene. So let's try playing it and see what we get. Click. Oh, yep. Something that we forgot is before we didn't set up our projectile, which we have now. So my projectile right here, you can just go and grab your prefab and drop it onto the projectile script, which should be on your rotate point. So now let's try this. And there we go. So if you move, you can jump, you can shoot underneath you, up in the sky. This can go all the way to the end to kind of set the greatest distance, make sure it looks like our particles are not being destroyed before we leave. You notice every time that we click, we get this particle clone that pops up, and then after 2 seconds, they go away. Because if they didn't, basically they would last forever, and you would see more and more of these instantiated game objects fill up your hierarchy as you clicked. So this is just an efficient way to get rid of them as you go. So I talked earlier about what would happen if you did set your rigid body to dynamic, so I can show you that real fast. On the projectile, if we change this to dynamic, you'll see that these will start being affected by gravity. So we change the gravity scale on this one to something like 3, maybe, just to show you what it looks like. So now, instead of getting ones that just go forever in any direction, you kind of get this drop off on them. Which if you're doing like a bow or something, maybe this is what you want. Like you want to set up an arc. But it's just up to you as the designer, like what you want your projectiles to behave like. But that's a way to change them pretty easily. So I'm going to just go ahead and set mine back to kinematic, but different options. So that should be, you can kind of set up a projectile system that is mouse-based inside of Unity. This also works for top-down. It works almost exactly the same. I think it works exactly the same because you'll just move around and then you can fire projectiles, in the 360 around you. All right, thank you all.